Plants are arguably the most important life form on Earth because of their ability to use sunlight to make their own food. It is also awe-inspiring that using sunlight, plants can take inorganic carbon from carbon dioxide and use it as a raw material to make organic compounds like glucose. This glucose is then oxidized to make ATP, which is used to power cellular processes. So the organic matter that's produced by plants not only serves to nourish them, but most other life forms as well. To survive, animals must rely either on the consumption of plants or other animals who consume plants. Plants are also essential to life because the process of photosynthesis not only results in the production of glucose, but also oxygen as a byproduct. This oxygen is essential for aerobic respiration, which allows a greater amount of energy to be extracted from the oxidation of organic molecules. Plants are also an important source of medicinal compounds like aspirin and other products like paper. Although there are some exceptions, there are characteristics that are shared by most or all plants. To begin with, all plants are eukaryotes. More specifically, plants are multicellular eukaryotes, which means that they have tissues. Additionally, all plants have cell walls, and they have an outer waxy coating known as a cuticle, which helps to prevent the loss of water or desiccation. Another characteristic of plants is that they're autotrophs, and more specifically, they're photoautotrophs. As we already discussed, this simply means that they use sunlight energy to synthesize organic molecules like glucose. Plants are also characterized by the fact that they have protected embryos, which means that the embryo develops within the protected environment of the female parent. And finally, plants have alternating life cycles, which means that they have a diploid and a haploid stage, or a diploid and haploid parts. Because plants are unable to move, they've developed some neat adaptations to address challenges like reproduction, access to sunlight, water and nutrients, and predation. We'll cover some of these adaptations today, but you'll explore plant adaptations in more detail during next week's discussion. In this week's module, you'll be learning about simple plants and gymnosperms. More specifically, we'll be covering the bryophytes, which lack vascular tissues and seeds and include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And we'll also look at some vascular plants, the ferns, which have vascular tissues but lack seeds, and the gymnosperms, which have vascular tissues and naked seeds but lack flowers. The earliest land plants grew close to the ground because they lacked a vascular system to transport water and nutrients. The only way these substances could move was by diffusing from one cell to another. Diffusion and osmosis are slow processes, so plants that rely on these processes alone can only grow a few centimeters tall. Despite this, three groups of plants, the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses, which are collectively known as the bryophytes, lack a vascular system. These plants lack the types of cells known as tracheids, which are cells that make up the vascular system of other plants. Because bryophytes lack a vascular system, they're small and they grow in moist environments. They don't have true roots, but they actually have root-like structures that are known as rhizoids, and these are used for anchoring the plant. Although bryophytes are common in moist environments, they actually can become dormant when the soil dries out, and they're able to resume cellular processes when water becomes available. As I mentioned previously, plants exhibit alternation of generations. When you look at the spongy mass of a bryophyte, what you're looking at is the haploid or gametophyte part of the life cycle. Because of this, bryophytes are said to have a dominant gametophyte. In other words, the adult moss plants are haploid. Their cells have a single set of chromosomes. There are male and female moss, liverwort, and hornwort plants that have male and female reproductive parts that are located at the tips of the stems. The female parts are known as archegonia, which is the plural form of archegonium, and this part houses the eggs. The male parts are known as antheridia, and they house the sperm. We'll use the moss as an example of the life cycle of bryophytes. When water collects, as it happens after a rainstorm, sperm are able to swim from an antheridium to an archegonium to fertilize the eggs. A diploid zygote forms when the gametes come together. This zygote divides through mitosis to form the embryo. As you can see, the embryo remains sheltered within the female reproductive structure, and that provides nutrients and water to the developing embryo. This embryo grows into a sporophyte, which is dependent on the gametophyte for water and nutrients. That sporophyte contains a capsule that is known as a sporangium. And inside this capsule, cells undergo meiosis to give rise to haploid spores, which are single cells. This is what the sporangia of the sporophyte look like. When these capsules break, they release spores, and these spores grow into new haploid male and female moss plants, and that completes the life cycle. The evolution of vascular tissue allowed plants to grow larger because it provided a way for plants to transport water and nutrients faster and more effectively than cell-to-cell diffusion. The roots of vascular plants can penetrate deep enough into the soil to reach moisture even when the surface of the soil is dry. The roots also anchor the plant, and they provide the support that it needs to allow it to grow upward without tipping over. Vascular plants contain specialized cells that form vascular tissue. In these plants, the xylem transports water and nutrients from the soil into the roots and up to the higher tissues of the plant. The phloem, on the other hand, allows for the transport of photosynthetic products like glucose from the leaves to storage tissues in the plant. It should be noted that the process of osmosis is still needed for water to enter the roots of vascular plants. However, the presence of the vascular system allows more efficient transport of water to the rest of the plant. Ferns are the most familiar seedless vascular plants. Although ferns have a vascular tissue, they still need water for reproduction, as we'll see in a moment. In ferns, the dominant stage, the stage that you see when you look at the plant, is the sporophyte or diploid stage, whereas the gametophyte is a reduced free-living stage. Many ferns have sporangia on the underside of their leaves, and this is where haploid spores are produced and eventually released. These spores are carried by the wind, and eventually they land in moist soil where they grow into a small heart-shaped gametophyte. And remember that the gametophyte is haploid. The gametophyte has cells that produce sperm and cells that produce eggs. The sperm that are produced by the gametophyte swim through drops of rainwater to fertilize an egg. This fertilized egg or diploid zygote eventually grows into an adult fern. As we've seen, the evolutionary development of vascular tissue allowed plants to grow larger. This adaptation allowed vascular plants to colonize areas where the surface of the soil isn't always wet. This is because the roots could penetrate the soil to reach water and nutrients. The next big innovation in plant evolution was the seed. The seed-bearing vascular plants include the Gymnosperms, which lack flowers, and the Angiosperms or flowering plants. A seed is essentially an embryonic plant with its own water and food supply and surrounded by a protective coating. Unlike spores, which are single haploid cells, seeds contain a multicellular diploid embryo, and they have a store of nutrients that consists mostly of starch, though it also contains lipids. Though both Gymnosperms and Angiosperms have seeds, today we'll be focusing on the Gymnosperms. The Gymnosperms include four major groups: the Gyngkos, which have fan-shaped leaves, the Cycads, which have palm-like fronds and small leaflets, the Gnetophytes, some of which are shrub-like, and the Conifers, which include pines, spruces, cedars, redwoods, and other species. Many conifers have needle-like leaves, as you can see here, and that actually serves as an adaptation to dry environments, and that's because the reduced surface area of the leaves actually helps to prevent water loss. Since Gymnosperms are vascular plants, they have vascular tissue. They also have leaves, shoots, and roots through which the vascular system extends. The roots of Gymnosperms are tap roots as opposed to fibrous roots. In these roots, water is absorbed through specialized cells known as root hair cells, and the water is then transported to the rest of the plant through the xylem. As with ferns, the dominant stage of Gymnosperms is the sporophyte, which is diploid. But unlike ferns, the gametophyte of Gymnosperms is microscopic, so these are just the sperm and the egg, which are located within plant parts. In Gymnosperms, these haploid cells are present within female cones that hold the eggs or ovules, and male cones that contain pollen, which houses the sperm. When a pollen grain, which is carried by the wind, lands near the egg in a female cone, sperm from the pollen grain move through the pollen tube into the ovule, and a sperm fertilizes an egg. The external layer of the ovule or egg forms the seed coat. This seed, which can be carried away from the plant in a variety of ways, eventually lands and germinates into a new diploid plant. Some conifers are majestic trees. They include both the tallest and the oldest living organisms on Earth, from redwoods to giant sequoias. Given their resilience, scientists are exploring the threat of climate change on these trees and the potential ways we could use these trees to help fight climate change.